Is a constant need to prove yourself combined with the belief that you're not good enough keeping you from being the person that you want to be? This week, I talk with Caroline Ray, an executive coach who shares her story of living in a burnout cycle for over 15 years due to the pressure to prove herself and the fear of being outed as a fraud. In this conversation, Caroline shares how she came to recognize the need for change, including a family intervention, and what advice she has for others who are facing similar challenges. We also talk about how to shift from doing your job to managing your career. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Caroline. It is such a pleasure to meet you today, and I can't wait to have this conversation. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Hi, Kim. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited to talk today. So I'm an executive coach and career strategist. I work primarily with women to help them navigate the world of work in a way that is more energizing and with more ease and less stress, and also to think more around their career strategy. So getting much clearer about career strategy rather than just the job that they're working in. So I've worked with a lot of women over time to do that. And before I was a coach, I spent a bit of time in a number of different sectors and domains. I spent a bit of time in tackling health inequality. I spent a bit of time in central government, including working at 10 Downing Street, which was really interesting. And then I spent a bit of time in tech. And I think my experience in all of those domains showed me how challenging it can be to manage your imposter syndrome. But I also saw myself and a number of women sort of stagnate or burnout at peak points in their career. And that's what really led me into working as a coach. I think my own experience of being in a cycle of burnout for 15 years plus, and then very serious burnout, but also just recognizing lots of talented women sort of struggle with a number of different things that are unique to women. And there's lots of tools and techniques that will support them to move forward, but it's easy to say and hard to do. And I think that's what's so brilliant about this podcast as well, is recognizing that it's easy to say and hard to do.
Exactly. So I want to dig in, if it's okay with you, to your own burnout cycle. And what did it look like, and how did you know that that's kind of what it was?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would say that I didn't know. And actually, it was really when my family and friends and my husband started effectively doing an intervention. They were really flagging, we're concerned about your health, we're concerned about how you're working quite long, you're not sleeping. And my response at that time was, I felt very frustrated with them. I felt like they just didn't get it. They didn't understand what my job was like. They didn't understand the demands of my job. And they didn't really understand that there wasn't really an option to not work. Like, that just wasn't, to not take the call at 11 p.m. at night, to not be up at 5 a.m. to get some stuff done before I headed to the office. I very much felt like just very disconnected. They didn't get it, and was completely in that tunnel. And it wasn't until my husband took me aside for a slightly more serious conversation that I suddenly realized, he was basically like, we can't continue in this cycle. I don't think he was threatening divorce. I don't think that's what he was doing. But I think he was sort of putting his hand up and saying, this is having a really negative impact on us and on me as well. And that was the sort of moment where I was like, oh, okay, something needs to change. But I didn't know what needed to change. And that was the big challenge. I knew something needed to change, but I couldn't see how, I'd just give up this job that was very demanding, but also very recognized externally as a successful, prestigious job. And so I was like, well, I can't just give up. And, I'm responsible for all of these people and this role. And also it would feel like failure. So I knew something needed to change, but I could not see the wood from the trees at all. And I still, at that point, I felt like things were okay, but another tell that I had a bit after that conversation was I started acting quite out of character. So started reacting very badly. And I got into a couple of wrangles, I think we'll call them, with colleagues that, again, is very out of character for me. So there was lots of signs and symptoms there, but I just didn't really, I was sort of too in it to notice it. And I think that is the challenge with burnout a lot of the time.
Well, I love the way you say you knew something needed to change, but you didn't know what, because I think when you are in it and you feel like I'm barely getting by, right? I've got all of this work to do. This is my career. This is where I want to be at some level.
Yes.
What could possibly give, right? Like you're saying, it felt like giving up to make the kind of change that would improve your overall well-being or lifestyle, whatever the case may be. And so in hindsight, I guess, like where did you come to, and like, is there something you would have done differently in that moment now that you've had time to reflect on it?
Yeah, I mean, there's like as always, there's a gazillion things I would do differently. And I'll talk about what changed, and I'll talk about what I would do differently, because I think that's quite important. So what I did do, a friend of mine said, go see my coach. She's brilliant. You'll come out feeling 10 feet tall anytime you go see her. So I went and did a session with this coach. We had a look at my values. And what I realized was that none of my values were being satisfied or were really present in my work. And that felt like the floodlights came on. I suddenly was like, oh, it's a mismatch with my values. That's why I've had this gnawing feeling at this sort of pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right, but I didn't quite know what was not right. And then latterly, I was as I got more seriously burnt out, I became much more cynical. And I started questioning people's motives. And I thought, what's the point of this work? This is all completely pointless. One of my values is progress. So, my progress, family, friends' progress, clients, community, the world. And when I was working in this place, I started questioning, is this actually progressing? Is this making a difference in the world? What's it doing? And the answer kept coming up as no. Objectively, it was, but just because I was so burnt out, I was really questioning. So that was a moment of recognizing, oh, it's not that I'm crap at my job. It's not that I'm rubbish. It's not that I'm lesser than. It doesn't feel this bad because I'm not very good and I'm not good enough. It feels bad because my values are not aligned. In addition to, I'm overworking, I'm not asking for help, I'm quite isolated. These are all factors that we know contribute to burnout. But it was a real moment of clarity and relief. And then what I did was I still couldn't quite figure out, well, what does it mean and where do I, how do I get out in a way that feels good? And so what I ended up doing was sort of finishing off the bit that I needed to do with the team and landed the big bit of project that probably took about 6 months. And then I made a move into something that I'd done before that was sort of a sideways move effectively. But I went there because I knew the people, I knew the work, I knew it was more aligned to my values. And I knew that it would be a safe space effectively where I could sort of feel confident and move forward. The challenge with that was what I actually needed to do was finish at work and take a break. And I would be, I was in the position where I could have taken, 3 months, maybe a bit longer out. But the not good enough in me, that imposter syndrome, said, you can't just leave a job and do nothing. People will know that you failed. And so I leapt into this other job, and that was okay, but it wasn't confidence. It was okay in terms of like, I could go there, I could do my job, but it wasn't. I remember sort of putting my fingers on my pulse at one point during the day, because I was so numb. And this sounds very dramatic reflecting on it, but I was so numb that I felt like I had to check that I was like, am I alive? Like, what's like, I'm not feeling any sensation. And that is that's a very serious burnout experience. I don't believe anyone needs to experience that. Unfortunately, lots of people do. So the lesson I learned from that burnout experience, which and I'm grateful that I had that experience, because it's taken me on the path that I've been on since. But the lesson I learned is you need to know your values and how they're satisfied. And also, how can you get them satisfied through your career and your job? That's really important. When you're working against your values, you're at risk of burnout, but also you will doubt, like that drives that self-doubt as well. And the other thing is, if you are burnt out and you can afford to take a break, then it's really important to, recharge, rest, recoup, and think more clearly rather than diving into something else. So that's what I would do quite differently. So I was responsible really for knowing my values. And of course, the other things you learn is how your imposter syndrome shows up. Yeah, mine definitely shows up in overworking. It definitely shows up in having to do it all by myself. Like, it's sort of, as you said earlier, it's like you've got your fingers in all of the holes and all of the dams, and you can't quite see. You're like, what finger can I take out? None of them. So interesting to figure out, oh, that's how my imposter syndrome shows up, and that's how that not good enough drives behavior that can lead you into quite an unsustainable place at work.
That is such a fascinating connection, because I think that's a really great way to capture one of the effects of imposter syndrome, right? If you never feel good enough, you feel like you constantly have to prove yourself. And like you said, I need to do it alone, because otherwise that's cheating, or, it's a sign of weakness of some sort. I need to do more. I loved what you said too about, if you took a break, people would know you failed. And so there's so much that's linked to preventing this perception that you're not good enough, right? And it just creates this vicious perpetuation of the overwork, the proving, et cetera, right? And you can see how people who are in the thick of it can't really examine that in a more distanced way, right? Do you have thoughts on, let's imagine we've got people listening right now who are thinking, oh my gosh, that's me, right? She's talking about me. Is there a first step? Is there a way to kind of, if you can't, like you said, if you can't take a break because you can't afford to leave your job, like, what's step one to slowing down enough to be able to have this conversation with yourself?
Yeah, I think the first step, I think it can be very helpful. Like, if you're thinking, this is me, this is, I'm feeling very burnt out, but I can't see the way to do it. I think the first step is to ask for help. And you can ask for help from someone. It doesn't have to be someone at work. It can just be, it can be someone in your family, your partner. It can be, a good friend. And I think the first step is to really almost get it all out on paper, or whatever way works for you. Some people it's talking it through, some people it's, getting it down on paper, but really understanding what am I feeling and what's actually going on. Where do I feel that I'm stretched? Where do I feel like I'm out on a limb? Where do I feel like I can't let go? Where do I feel like I'm covering for other people? Because that's often something that, as what we see often with high achievers is that, as you I'm not going to use the word unravel, is not the right word, but as you feel less control, you can't, this was my experience, the more out of control I felt, the more I tried to control. So the more I said yes to, and the more work I was trying to do. And again, in that, I don't want to get found out. So really identifying, not where are you playing out of your zone, but like, you know, what work are you doing that you shouldn't be doing that's actually not yours to do? It might be yours to lead and direct, but it might not be yours to do. And then look at, how is this showing up for me in terms of, am I sleeping? Am I, you know, what's my like health like? What are my relationships like? I think we're coming out of it, or we're moving away from it, but certainly, you know, the corporate world has always been about sacrificing your health and relationships for, you know, that's worked. It's been very powerful for the corporate world for a long time, thriving on, I believe, people's not good enoughness, and I don't want to be found out, and desire to really achieve. So I think if you can sit down with a friend, sit down with someone who's safe, you know, someone who's outside of work is actually often quite helpful because they're not in the world with you, and just map that out, or do it by yourself if you feel like you can, but just get something down on paper so you can be. And I think that process helps create a bit of space in the brain. But also, if you come back to that paper 24 hours later, you might be able to then be like, okay, this is clearer to me now. This shouldn't be happening. You know, that shouldn't be happening. I need more of this. And then I think what can be helpful from there is to figure out, what do you want to expand? So that might be asking for help. It might be delegating more. It might be talking to your boss about what's going on and what support you need. What do you want to shrink? Which might be saying yes to everything. It might be working all the hours so that you can expand, having some time at home or time to look after yourself. What do you want to eliminate altogether? And then you can start to try and put some of those boundaries in place. And those are small, but they need to be small steps. Otherwise, your brain is going to do the trick of, well, that's your brain's going to do the trick of like, oh, you're not good enough. That's not what you're meant to do. So you have to start really, really small with it. But I think that would be my first step.
What's the role of gender in this conversation? Why is this so much more problematic for women?
I think it's more problematic for women because we know that, I can't remember what the latest stat is, but we know that women take on more of the office housework. So sort out the Christmas tree, buy the leaving, you know, gift, help with the office desk moves, by quite some way. I think it's like 70 or 80%. And we also know that women do more of the housework at home, and at housework I mean that, you know, childcare, housework, all of that stuff. In addition to that, there's a number of barriers that women face that are blocks to progression. So there is an extra level of needing to back your value, needing to be more visible, needing to, you know, versus our male counterparts. And we're not rewarded for that in the workplace. And so that also plays to our not good enough. So that proving it energy is something I see with clients a lot, that like, you know, I've got my promotion, I need to prove myself now. And it's like, you don't need to prove yourself. You proved yourself getting the promotion. Now what you need to do is figure out where you want to have your impact and how you do that in a way that is impactful, energizing, and, you know, as with more ease. Not to say there's not challenge or hard work, of course, but so I think it's more complex because we have less time doing the stuff that is just about moving forward in our career. And it's harder for us to do that because of the systemic cultural barriers as well. And all of that is just more burn, it's more friction, it's more effort, It's more messages that we're not where we're supposed to be. And if we try and get where we're supposed to be, that also, you might be seen as aggressive, or so it's a real compounding effect. So it's quite a bit more to get through.
Yeah, I think you bring up so many important points. And I was thinking about this when you were talking too about the idea of what are you doing that you shouldn't be doing, right? Mm-hmm. Paraphrasing what you're saying of taking on the additional work. And I think that proving the need to prove yourself is a big part of this. Yeah. I don't think men feel guilt or shame when they say no to their boss because they already have a full plate. Like, to them, that feels strategic. It feels like, oh, no, I'm not going to focus on lower value, lower priority activity. I'm going to focus on what makes the most sense for my role, without that inner critic that says you're weak, or if you could, the fact that you can't do it means you're not good enough, kind of a conversation, right? And I think that is inherently limiting, because to your point, there's only so much that we can do and that we should be leading other people to do. And so as we achieve the goal of advancing to higher levels of the organization, if we hold on to that need to prove ourselves and we feel like we need to do everything ourselves, and we inevitably hit a wall because there's only so many hours in the day, right? And so I think a combination of, I constantly feel like I need to do the work myself. I need to prove myself. Maybe I don't want to burden my team because I know how busy they are too. So there's this caretaking aspect to it. Maybe I don't feel like I can have an honest conversation with my boss because then he's going to realize I don't know what I'm doing or I don't belong here. And the fact that we just don't necessarily have the same kinds of relationships that men might have with senior leaders, where they can just in casual conversation talk about their needs, what resources are required, right? Like what's happening behind the scenes in the work that's going on. And so it just feels like the more I achieve my goals, right? Like the higher up I go, the more demand there is, the more I have to prove myself. And then this whole burnout piece that you're talking about just gets more and more powerful.
Yeah. You're really right. I think it's something that I hear from clients a lot, which is, I want to go for the promotion. I deserve, they'll say that in our, confidential, safe space. I deserve that. I work for it. I'm at least as good, if often not better than, my male counterparts who have similar peers. And yet there's a concern about, but can I handle it? Will the stress be too much? What about my, home life? I don't want to have to do 24/7 working hours. And I think when you combine that with I think there's two interesting things. There's the transition from doing to leading. It's a very challenging transition for everyone at that, from going from being recognized and given the gold star for doing the tasks and the projects, and suddenly you move to this place where you don't get the recognition because you're leading through people. And that's very challenging, particularly when lots of people want external validation. They want recognition and reward, because that way they feel like, I know I'm doing a good job and I know I'm proving, that I can know I'm proving myself. And you get less love and attention as you go further up the organization. So I think it is really important to start to build your own evidence, and so that you can self-validate. So a big piece that supports me now, even, and certainly when I was but certainly as I was learning how to navigate, or not navigate imposter syndrome, it's work alongside with your imposter syndrome, is building that evidence bank. So starting to really understand what value you bring to the table, start tracking those wins and start celebrating them, so that you can be clear with yourself and have that clarity about, the results that you get, the strengths and skills that you have, and what the outcomes of that is for you, for your team. Because one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, particularly women, is that they think that their work will speak for them. And it doesn't. It just doesn't, particularly the more senior you get. And the reason for that is because only a very limited number of people see the depth of your work and the amount of detail and work that you do. The thing that, I think is about, someone did a study on it, I think 10% of the work you do actually contributes to people's understanding of your impact. So, and also to your career opportunities. And so if you're relying on your work speaking for you, then that's going to make life really challenging, in addition to the other challenges. So being able to really talk to the work that you're doing and the value that it brings to the table. And I think also recognizing those relationships that you need to spend time in. So what you were talking about in terms of like men, tend to be quite good at those side conversations and asking for what they need. We know that women tend not to do that. I think it's called pre-wiring. So around the edges of meetings, of course, that's been harder over the last 3 years with the pandemic, but around the edges of meetings. So again, it's really distinguishing between doing the job and managing your career. So one of the other mistakes I see that I think is imposter-driven syndrome is women focus all their energy and attention, which is limited anyway, on their job, doing the job, getting it done, as quickly as they can and to the best of their ability. And what happens is they sacrifice that. Well, where is this taking me? What do I need to be doing? Who do I need to be talking so that I'm always moving forward? So there's always a piece to look at, which is about that career strategy. Like, how is this moving me forward? What do I need to do next? What network do I need to build? What conversations do I need to have? But the proving it drive will tend to keep us focused just in the day-to-day of doing the job to the best that we can. And also that in itself is quite stressful, because all of a sudden you then look up and you've been passed over for a promotion. And that can be really, and that doesn't help with our sort of proving it energy either.
Well, you said something earlier too about control, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think this is a form of gaining control to just try to have everything.
Yes.
You're the one managing everything, right? And I think we do that sometimes at home.
Yeah.
That in our work environments. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, because from my perspective, as somebody who has had a lifelong anxiety disorder, I'm all about control. And I think so much of what we're trying to do when we're trying to control things is to prevent something catastrophic from happening. And we're imagining the potential catastrophes and all of the fallout that will come if we don't do the things that we're doing. And I think sometimes it just requires a leap of faith to do the scary thing that you are like avoiding, to then realize, oh, that catastrophic event didn't come, right? So when you're talking about letting go of some of the day-to-day stuff that we hold on to so tightly, I'm sure there are a lot of people thinking that's not possible. There's no way that could work. And I think part of it is I just have to believe that it does. Do it. And on the other side, find out that the sky didn't fall, right? The world is still standing.
I couldn't agree more. I think what's important is to recognize you will have done that many times already in your life and career, but we forget, because we forget about all we're always looking at like, what's the next mountain to climb? How do we do it safely? How do I do it without getting soaking wet? How do I do it with enough snacks in my bag? We don't look back at all the mountains that we already climbed at all. So again, I think, it's really great to go back and think about, where have I navigated uncertainty before? Uncertainty is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's only going to increase. And I think it's one of the critical skills actually to really develop and practice, as a leader, but also as a human living in the world. So recognizing that sometimes you do need to take the leap. I mean, even if I think about how imposter shows up for me now, imposter syndrome shows up for me now, even with this podcast coming to talk to you today. So I was obviously really excited about coming to talk to you today, but I would say sort of 24 hours in advance, I started getting but have you learned enough? Do you know enough? Like, what happens if you fluff up your, if you stumble across your words? What happens if? And 5 years ago, if that had happened, if I'd been teeing up for this conversation, I would have procrastinated for a long time instead of doing what we did, which was like we connected, we talked about what was going to be most useful for your listening audience. We talked about how the session was going to work. I then went away and made sure I was clear on what I wanted to share. And then did some work, which I'll talk about, around how to set myself up for success, which included not looking at my notes before I came on to the session, dancing around to J-Lo, which is always a great way to get into the zone, and also looking at the evidence of what I do know and what I do bring to the table. If I had been coming onto this podcast 5 years ago, I'd have procrastinated for a very long time. No, but in a way that felt very, was very stressful. I would have then crammed for, made it very difficult for myself. I'd have sort of sat at my desk with a kind of punishment stick, like, you must do this right, you must learn all these things. And before coming on, I'd have been cramming rather than thinking about, how do I want to connect with Kim? How do I want to show up? How can I make my space nice and calm so I'm having a good time? And so I think it's not as sexy as being like, oh, I'm a huge adventurer. But the way that you learn to really support yourself is in these small shifts, and also recognizing you're still going to feel your fraudy friend, your friend who's like, you're a fraud, is still going to come knocking. Mm-hmm. I even know that, I have a great time on this show and I'll feel great after it. But I know about 24 hours now, from when we finish, I know that I'll get I probably didn't say that quite the right way, or I'll get I probably sounded a bit silly then. So I know that's coming. And I also know I've got a few tools to help me with that as well. But I think that's the thing about uncertainty. You have to leap in, because every time you leap in, it's more evidence that you can do it. And just making sure you keep capturing that evidence and taking the leap. And the other thing is, you can take the leap if it doesn't work out. No one will remember. You might remember, no one else will. And you can make changes. I think there's a really brilliant, I want to say it was might have been Jeff Bezos. I know we don't really like to talk about him too much now, but I think he talked about a 1-door or a 2-door decision. So being clear about whether this is a decision you make that you can change, like buying a house or something. Obviously you can change that. It's just very, 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 very expensive to do it. Or a 2-door decision, which is like, I'm going to experiment. I can experiment with this, and then I can also go back if I don't want to. So a 1-door decision would be, I guess, like having children. A 2-door decision is, I want to go and try this new career in this new sector, or I'm going to take a sabbatical. Like, you can always go back to work, particularly if you're a midlife, professional. Like, you have so much experience under your belt. And there's time for more than one career. So I think just also being mindful about what do you get to do? Like, what do you get to do? What's the upside of the opportunity? That's certainly what I was thinking about today coming onto the podcast. It's like, I get to meet Kim. I get to spend an hour with her. I get to share, we get to share our thoughts together, rather than, oh my God, it's all going to be so terrible. What am I going to do? People are going to find me out.
I think that's such an important point, that we can choose how we evaluate a situation, right? We can think about, there are lots of different ways to think about any given situation, but choosing to focus on the opportunity, choosing to focus on how do I want to show up as opposed to all the terrible things that might happen is just a more empowering way to live our lives. And to your point, let's say that you came on here and you said something silly. First of all, we probably would have cut it out and re-recorded it. But let's say we didn't, right? Like nobody but you is going to remember that. Everybody's going to remember your story and how much it resonated with them, right? And I think that's really important for everybody listening to remember too. And I've often joked about, my therapist told me years ago, Kim, you are the center of your universe. You're not the center of the universe. Nobody thinks about you as much as you think they do, right? And it was this very liberating comment that she made. Like, yeah, you're right. Nobody else is thinking about me. And, people aren't leaving this podcast thinking, I cannot believe that she fumbled through that word, right? That's like, I'll think about it at 3:00 in the morning. No one else cares. And I think just reminding ourselves of that is a really helpful way to navigate, like you're saying, this uncertainty and these intimidating situations, because we're so aware of every little thing we do. Nobody else cares.
Yeah, it's always a moment when you're either told or someone, you realize no one is paying attention. Like no one is paying attention. They're all busy worrying about their own stuff.
That's right.
They're busy with their own stuff. So yeah, it's very liberating. It's liberating. It's a liberating place to operate from.
It really is. And I love your point about building evidence too, because I see that in two directions. Number one is, how do I take stock of all of the things I have done, all the mountains I have climbed, and really celebrate those and not just let them pass me by, but also how do I create evidence by focusing on the things that I want to be known for, or the strengths that I have. How do I lean more fully into those? And so I think that's such a really great point too for people to take away from this is, what is that evidence bank?
Yeah, and that's a lovely framing, Kim, about, what can I create and how can I focus even more intentionally on my strengths, the experiences that I want to have, the things that I want to try. But yeah, I think that's a really beautiful framing.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm on LinkedIn, Caroline Ray. I'm also CarolineRayCoaching.com website. And yeah, you can drop me a DM or just explore more over there.
And I will link to that in the show notes as well. And thank you again. This has been such a great conversation.
It has. Thank you so much, Kim. It's been wonderful to spend some time with you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.